Okay, everyone, this is Nathan Lindorf with the Rational Independent. Apologize for tweaking the camera. I am starting today's live stream. It is Monday, January 30th, and today we're going to build on the topic I started in this morning's video. As I thought about it through the day, I realized that I barely scratched the surface on a very important point. One of the things that I'm trying to do as we discuss these different news items is build a cohesive framework between like a pointless painting between the various seemingly independent pieces of information or news items or pieces of analysis out in the world and stitch those together into a more cohesive view. Because if you take a look at the world and you are paying attention and you're thinking critically, you can often find patterns. You can often find evidence of coordination. So Um, this whole channel kicked off talking a little bit about why Steven Crowder was so mad at the Daily Wire, what their offer revealed, what their conversation and negotiations revealed, and um, one of the we're dealing with the he said she said, and this morning's video also dealt with the he said she said, the stereotypical case where no one really knows exactly what happened, but everyone's feelings are hurt, and the world is on fire and it's full of drama. And that can be very frustrating, especially from the outside in, especially if you have loyalty or care for both parties. It kind of feels like you have to split sides, choose sides, and it gets to be a mess. So, one of my rubrics, one of my rules for parsing out a he said, she said, or a case where you have something that's a little iffy, and this will become more clear as we move into today's main topic, where you have a left and a right bias to the reporting of a news item, is if you distill down the pieces of reporting that both sides agree on and set aside the analysis that they argue about. If you look and you say, okay, what are the facts? What is the fact pattern? What is the piece of information that both sides agree on? And we can take that as pretty certain that that's going to be accurate or likely true, um, because two antagonistic people are unlikely to agree on, unlikely to collude on a false piece of facts. So when it comes to Stephen Crowder and the Daily Wire, some things that they both agree on. They both agree that the terms of the contract that were published by Stephen Crowder and later in more detail by Daily Wire, that those terms were the contract that was under discussion. They then proceeded to argue about whether or not those were reasonable, whether or not those were frustrating or wrong or whatever, but they both agreed that the terms were faithfully represented by both sides. They both agreed that $50 million was the offer from the Daily Wire. They disagreed about whether or not that was enough, et cetera, et cetera. So that's an example of a he said, where there's a lot of subjective presentation of facts. There's a lot of room for bias and trying to twist the narrative and get people on your side. And that's unfortunate. Much better to have crisp and clear terms and crisp and clear resolution. But unfortunately, life is not a 20-minute Saturday morning cartoon. Things are rarely so cut and dried. So that leads me to the topic that we discussed in this morning's video, which was the resurfacing of the allegations by Christine Blasey Ford and some other people against Brett Kavanaugh, now Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh. And the simple truth is there's no way to tell who's right and who's wrong conclusively. It is outside of human ability to do so. So we can make a lot of noise. We can spread a lot of pain around. A bunch of people made a bunch of money over a story like this. You can't ignore that. But in the end, it's an inconclusive mess. And one of the problems I have with this kind of story is that you can have well-meaning people, regular, ordinary people. This becomes the news item of the day. This becomes the cycle that's being discussed. One person decides to side on one end, one person decides to side on the other, and then they sit down to discuss this, and you can ruin friendships. You can split families apart. You can cause all kinds of drama over these let's call them edge cases, these marginal cases, these things where the fact pattern isn't quite so clear. So if we're looking at the Brett Kavanaugh controversy, everyone agrees with the fact pattern that Brett Kavanaugh went to college. I forget the college. Yale, maybe? I don't know. Went to an Ivy League school. Came from a wealthy family. Privileged upbringing. All of that, everyone agrees on. You could also say that everyone agrees to a certain extent that Brett Kavanaugh, in his youth, had a bit of a drinking problem. Was known to be someone who enjoyed alcohol a fair amount. It's not against the law. It's not against the rules. I mean, assuming he was of age. So that's a fact that we can probably accept. I think it's fair to say that it's more likely than not that Christine Blasey Ford, I apologize if I'm mispronouncing it, was likely assaulted as a teenager. And that is a horrible tragedy. I don't think anyone's contesting that point. Beyond that is where things get messy. So, the core of today, how do we tie these two things together? Here's the core idea that I want to unpack today and discuss. There is a pattern in modern media where the cases that exemplify a particular pet issue, whether it's gun violence, suicide, abortion, big tech censorship, whatever you want to call it, the cases that exemplify these issues, the ones that are picked to be amplified in the media are not the cases that are the clearest to analyze, not the cases that are the most able to be universalized, to be applied to the broadest number of people. They're not the most clear-cut cases. They tend to be marginal. They tend to be iffy and questionable. They tend to have key facts that can or should or can be obscured or can't be proven one way or the other. It's incredibly poisonous to be put in a position where you have to prove a negative, because it's nearly impossible. That's what happened to Brett Kavanaugh. Setting aside whether or not anything happened, being put in a position of proving you didn't do something 30 years ago. That's a nearly impossible standard to reach. Unless your life was on film at that time, unless you're a Kardashian or someone similar, that's just not going to happen. And so if you're maneuvered into a position where your only way forward, your only way to achieve culpability, to avoid culpability, to achieve acquittal, I guess, in the court of public opinion, is to prove a negative, to prove your innocence, buddy, you're toast. That's one of the reasons why the court system is tilted towards innocent until proven guilty. In other words, those who are accused don't have to prove their innocence. They don't have the burden of proof. The prosecution does. They have to prove guilt, prove culpability. Or even if someone did something terrible, if it can't be proven, they go free. So, why is it that these marginal cases are the ones that are amplified? Why is it that if you have a story about a black man who shoots another black man or several black people in gang-related violence, as is the case, unfortunately, almost like clockwork in several major American cities, it doesn't make the news. It isn't shouted about from the rooftops. And yet, what was his name? Uh, um, one of the ones that kicked off the police brutality, the young boy in Florida. Oh, I'm kicking myself. Shoot, I blanked. Um, of course, I've been thinking about this topic all day, and I had several ideas in my head of cases to discuss, and gone. The one where Barack Obama said, if I had a son, he'd look like, shoot. Anyway, shot to death by someone who uh, had said and done some weird stuff before and since. And man, it's on the tip of my tongue. I'm gonna finish this live stream and it's gonna pop right up for me. Anyway, it was widely publicized that he had like a Skittles and a soda in his sweater, that he was killed for wearing a hoodie in the wrong neighborhood, that he was an innocent man, that he was just a boy. And all of these things might be true, but they're not the whole truth. It's uncontested, as far as I'm aware, that there was a violent altercation, that blows were exchanged on both sides, that it was mutual combat. And if you get yourself into a mutual combat situation, uh, you you can't claim innocence. Um, Here I am, and I can envision the faces and the circumstances of the half a dozen or so major incidents of, let's call it, police brutality over the last decade or so, and the names escape me. So sorry about that. Um, Everything is Googleable, so I'll do my best just by describing. One story that is of particular circumstance, of particular significance to me, or that stands out to me amongst this pantheon, is the story of the man who uh, was shot by the cops 5 or 6 times trying to get into a van that had some kids in it. And it was presented that he was a single dad. He was trying to get his kids, and he was shot in the back. He was unarmed, etc. And that is a terrible tragedy. That's a problem. Until you get a little more context and you realize that it was a black woman who called the police, who said, I have a restraining order against this man, and he's coming to kidnap my children. That the children that were in the car were not lawfully in his custody. That he was getting ready to drive off with them and go who knows where. That he was reaching for a knife that he had on the floorboard of the van. That statistics and police training tells us that if you have a knife and you're within, I want to say 21 feet, I forget the exact measurement, that a knife is often quicker than a gun and just as deadly. In other words, having a knife, you are not unarmed. You are of serious risk to yourself, to the police, to the children in the car, who knows? That if you hadn't been stopped, you could have, instead of the knife, gotten in the car and driven away. Who knows what could have happened from there? Now, what makes this particularly concerning to me, particularly prototypical, is that this was beaten by the media drum to say that the police are dangerous, that white people are dangerous, that guns are dangerous, whatever the narrative at the time is. And the interesting thing is, this occurred in Kenosha, Wisconsin, which you might recall was the scene shortly thereafter, in conjunction with a protest over this specific shooting, where Rittenhouse, I remembered a name, yay, where Kyle Rittenhouse shot 3 people, killed 2 people and shot a third, arguably in self-defense. But it was a riotous, violent, chaotic situation. Thank goodness for video. If that had just been a story of he said, how on earth could you have untangled that knot? All the competing opinions and voices and everyone talking about what they saw and heard in the chaos. It would have been very difficult to bring justice in that circumstance. So, why are these the cases that are chosen? And I think, this is my theory, this is the pattern that I see. It's because if there is vagary, if there is, if there are question marks, if there's room for interpretation, that becomes something that you can use to form a narrative. If your interest is not in accurate factual reporting, but instead your interest is in taking little bits and pieces of fact and conjecture and forming a narrative, an overarching projection on reality, saying, this is what is significant. This is what is true. This is what these events mean. This is where we are going. If you do that, you need events that can be twisted. You need events that can be artfully and selectively edited. So the more we know about it, the harder it is to present that. So, one of the, it's a great tragedy when this sort of thing happens. And the reason why I wanted to tie in the Daily Wire Stephen Crowder situation is because the same thing happens here. And it draws out another point. One of Stephen Crowder's most painful and yet most damning accusations is that the Daily Wire, in addition to playing hardball in negotiations, which probably would have impacted their friendships, is actually, factually, extending the influence of big tech censorship into some of the biggest conservative voices in conservative media on YouTube and elsewhere. And that's significant because it underpins the idea of controlled opposition. It underpins the idea that as a movement, the people on the right, the conservatives, hear what they think they want to hear and believe that their spokespeople are doing everything they can to advance the cause. But in reality, those spokespeople are in the pocket of the opposition. They say the right things, but in reality, they won't go to the wall for their principles. There's a limit. There's a circle that's been drawn around them, and they've been told, don't step out of this circle or we'll destroy you. So, it doesn't matter which side you're on, both sides tend to promote and beat the drum and inflame emotions on these edge cases because it helps them to promote their own narrative. Now, I will say, all things being equal, I think the political left is more inclined to try and craft and promote narratives for a variety of reasons. But I have to say, I've seen this done on both sides. One of the things that we all love to see, we all love to get the juicy gossip and the secrets. And Project Veritas does amazing work. But they also have a narrative that they're trying to achieve. That they're trying to call it a counter narrative. But they're trying to show evidence of this misbehavior behind the scenes. They're trying to show that, for instance, in the news, there's a thing about someone from Pfizer, some director or whatever, talking candidly with someone who turned out to be an undercover rep of Project Veritas, saying, hey, you know, we're thinking about mutating COVID proactively and making vaccines against those mutations, just so we're ready in case it becomes an issue. It's a great way of us making money. And who doesn't like bragging about making money? So that is a very dangerous belief. That is something that is incredibly immoral for Pfizer, someone at Pfizer who's in position to make decisions, to be promoting. But is it the whole picture? We don't know. We only have snippets and segments essentially out of context. Now, am I defending Pfizer? No, I think they're evil. That's a whole other story outside the topic of today. Frankly speaking, Steven Crowder is guilty of this. This idea of trying to create a counter narrative, of trying to craft data to support what you're doing, but present it in a certain way that's very careful, choosing your words very carefully. He recorded Jeremy Boring, and you know when you're listening to something where one party knows they're recording and the other party doesn't, you know that the party that's recording is trying to get the other party to say something to support their point. And honestly, I think he was legally within his rights to do that. No one objects to it. No one contests that. But I think it was wise for him to do that. Sometimes for self-preservation, sometimes for an important enough reason, you have to be willing to lose even your friends if what you're doing you believe is right. And if that's a price that he was willing to pay, he probably lost some friendships forever. Probably cost himself some business opportunities in the future. It's going to be part of his reputation from here on out. But it was probably still the right thing to do. So, but he selectively edits it, as is his right, and presents it in a certain way in order to support his narrative. Human beings are narrative creatures. We are storytellers and story listeners at heart. We don't absorb abstract facts. The human mind is not a database. It's not a collection of discrete facts. It's not even a collection of facts that are linked together. In fact, it's very rare that we have those kind of oddly perverse linkages. Usually it requires an emotionally triggering event. Instead, we are storytellers. The human mind remembers information by telling itself a story, by making it part of a story. So, it's natural for someone who's pursuing political power or business power, marketplace power, to try and craft a narrative to support their goals. And it's a lot easier to craft that narrative that supports your goals if you pick cases that support your goals and you pick cases that are edge cases, that are marginal, that not all the information is known, because it lets you fill in the blanks. It lets you, frankly speaking, with the right set of circumstances, it lets you use reality as a Rorschach test. So, quick context, most people know the reference, but I'll explain it briefly. A Rorschach test is a psychological test designed by a clinician who wanted to get an idea of what people were preoccupied by. And so he created a series of ink blots, created a series of purely subjective drawings that had no content, literally no facts to them. And then he asked the person looking at them, what did they see when they were looking at the drawing? It became to be known as an ink blot test or a Rorschach test. So the idea is, if you take a story, if you take a set of facts, and honestly, strip most of the facts out of it, most of the content, most of the objective truth out of it, and leave instead, as much as you can, a set of subjective pieces, a subjective framework. What you've done then is create a story that people can emotionally resonate to, especially if they're already inclined to agree with you. They take your interpretation, they consider it fact, they consider it part of a story that they've been told, and they project their own preconditions, their own beliefs and bias onto that framework. And they buy into your narrative a little bit more. And if you get someone who's bought into a narrative, they are typically more easily manipulatable. If you honestly, critically think and object to every piece of evidence that comes across your brain, it's an exhausting way to live. It's incredibly inefficient. Nobody does it. I don't do it. Nobody does it. But if you did that, it would be very difficult to manipulate you. The best we can do is pull the old Reagan bit. Trust but verify. You have to be able to trust up front. You have to be able to offload some of that analytical effort to people that you trust. But you need to periodically check their work. You need to periodically look into their sources, look into what they're saying that backs up their case, their evidence. And if you find that they're lying to you, if you find that they're trying to manipulate the data to present reality twisted to fit their narrative, then you can't trust them anymore. Then you have to either look for new sources of data or go to that person and present your objections and get them to correct the error of their ways, or you have to stop doing business with them entirely. And I think that's what happened with Steven Crowder and Jeremy Bourne. Crowder knows his main enemy. His main enemy is censorship. His main enemy is people who say, I can't have you poking holes in my narrative. Otherwise, I can't make the money I need to make. I can't project the political power I need to project. Everything that I've built requires this narrative. And if you sit around poking holes in my narrative, then I can't do what I need to do. So I have to destroy you. Steven Crowder knows that the people who are trying to destroy him are people who object to him poking holes in their narrative. And here's the interesting thing. For a long time, he thought that those people were only on the left. And all that happened with this was that he thought he could trust the Daily Wire. And they showed him evidence. His verification failed. His verification that he could trust them. He trusted, then he verified, and the verification failed. So he pushed and he pressed and he prodded, and he got enough evidence back to realize that the Daily Wire was also trying to craft a narrative, that the Daily Wire was also trying to build a framework, a Rorschach test, to build a group of people who listened to them blindly, who accepted what they said, and capture as many people who were right-leaning into that narrative as they could. And so Steven Crowder said, I'm sorry, I don't do narratives, I don't do frameworks. I'm going to poke holes in that narrative. And so he presented some information in the marketplace that poked a hole in the narrative of how Daily Wire fights big tech and fights the government and fights censorship. Because that's something you hear them say all the time. Pay us subscription money so that we can carry on the fight against big tech. And Steven Crowder just said, hey, here's some information that runs counter to that narrative of yours. What do you want to do about it? And within a few days, you were getting posts and statements directly, personally attacking Stephen Crowder's character, saying things like, his action is despicable. It's a betrayal. He's being a little bitch. He needs to put on his big boy pants. This is just a negotiation. This is just a non-binding term sheet. Yada, yada, yada. They crafted a narrative to combat his questions, his challenge. So, my question to you is, what are you going to do if you're willing to look at this and say, I can't trust Stephen Crowder completely. He taped someone without their knowledge. He selectively edited and presented an audio tape that supports his narrative. He'll likely profit from these actions. And I can't trust the Daily Wire because they agree to the fact pattern that says we penalize our creators if they run afoul of big tech. If you can't trust either side, if you can't trust the narrative, but your brain is built to absorb a narrative, what are you going to do? I am headed up the mountains. I'm going to run out of signal shortly, so I'm going to end it here. I hope you enjoyed this conversation. Drop a comment if you like it. Let me know what you think, and have a wonderful day.